Welcome to Composer's Lab, Session 1, Intro. I'm your host, Sergei Kossenko. This is very exciting. This is our first session ever of this class, and it's going to be a 12-session class featuring 10 famous composers from the past, and then the intro, and the last session is going to be called Coda, which is, of course, finished, or actually tail in Italian, as an animal tail. So we've tested this concept before. The Composer's Lab has actually existed as a sort of a germ or a seed or an idea. And then now that we're doing this, I'm actually very, very excited, so I hope you are too. So let's not wait a single moment. Let's go. What is Composer's Lab? Well, when you think of a lab, of course, you think lab, laboratory. It's usually a chemical lab or a physics lab, you know, something that has maybe all these things bubbling and wheels rotating or something, steam coming out. That's what we usually imagine. But it's basically a place for experiments, right? So we're looking at something, we're testing something, we are inquiring into something, we're on a quest. We want to discover something new, and that's what Composer's Lab is actually about. Discovering something new about the music that we already know, or about the music we don't know yet. We kind of like get in the mindsets of these composers from the past through their music and through the knowledge of the time period and where they lived and what was going on in the world at that time and what might have influenced them. Well, you know, what kind of clothes people wore, what kind of food they ate. So when we consider all of these factors, somehow the music starts speaking to us, and we will basically be able to kind of reconstruct some of the things. And what's also interesting is that a lot of these composers that later were famous or were famous during their lifetime were in demand and published and played, their letters and other materials have been preserved by their friends and then later on, of course, by scholars and museums and libraries. So we actually get a pretty good glimpse into a lot of what was going on, and a lot of them confessing their soul, of course, very privately, but also describing their work on the compositions that they're currently working on. No exception is Beethoven. Tchaikovsky left lots of letters that we know that he talks about his music. Schubert, I mean, almost all of them left something that we can study. So before we go into the actual analysis of all the music, I'd like to say that when I was thinking what Composer's Lab could be, I sort of came up with this mission statement or a set of statements. You know, why Composer's Lab? What will it do? So what I came up with is this. And this looks like Composer's Lab egg, or maybe a galaxy far away or something like this. But let's just talk about it seriously very briefly. So first is promote academic musical knowledge. Now that sounds very pompous and official, but really what we're doing here is all of this accumulated knowledge over the history, we're going to use it to analyze the music, and then let's say the people who are professionals, who are scholars, who are musicians, performers, composers, conductors, you know, they already know a lot of this music theory and sort of like the backbone behind what makes the music tick. And other people, I would kind of compare maybe consumers of music with consumers of food. For instance, people love going to restaurants and they love particular cuisines and they might love how a particular chef makes a particular dish. But that's the whole point. They're fans of this dish, for instance. They cannot prepare this at home, nor do they know the right secret recipe there. But if you are a chef, let's say, you might be able to sample it and say, oh, I know exactly what it's got in it. I think that it was done a certain way. I think it was fried, not baked. I think it was sautéed, not boiled, etc., etc. So that's really what we're doing when we're promoting musical knowledge academically. We kind of spread it around so that more people get interested in it, which brings us to the second point: spark interest in a specific topic. Sometimes, and I know that from my young years, when some teacher of mine would say one thing to me, and all of a sudden it creates this kind of like what I call light bulb moment, you know. So you are all of a sudden on a quest to kind of find out more about whatever it was. You know, something maybe related to a certain way of playing a certain phrase, right? So, so when we discuss these things, I am really, really hoping and dreaming that a lot of you who are watching this and participating in this would actually get interested in maybe a specific composer, a specific piece, specific genre, or epoch of music making, and go there with us. And if I've done just that, I already feel very complete about what we're doing here. So present familiar things in a different light, well, that's pretty cool. It almost sounds like relativity theory, right? If you're here and then this is moving, then you see one thing, but if you're here and you are moving, then you will see this differently. So sometimes, and we'll actually do that today, this is our intro. So we're doing a lot of things kind of like hodgepodge from different genres and styles today, but when we focus on each particular composer in the subsequent sessions, that's kind of what we're going to be trying to do. Not just to say, oh, well, this is theme number one, this is theme number two. We're going to go deeper than that and hopefully be able to see certain things in a different light. Encourage those feeling discouraged. I almost wrote encourage the discouraged. That's what came to my mind. And then I thought, well, wait a second. So if somebody's feeling discouraged, that doesn't mean they're discouraged. So I'm going to be very fair here, we hope, and say that we're encouraging those feeling discouraged. Some people might have studied music when they were younger, and then they maybe quit, and perhaps they're finding a good excuse to get back into it. And classes like this, you know, where it's presented in a sort of almost, I would call it edutainment kind of a way, you know, with a little bit of humor sprinkling in, as we'll see with some examples from Beethoven and things like that. But I do like to say, I would like to say that if you are discouraged in music, please know that music is always there, and it is kind of like riding a bike. If you played an instrument, do pick it up, do try it, and I've seen people do that, and I've seen them succeed and just have the music part of their heart blossom again. So please do be encouraged. And then the last one, of course, is very simple: inspired to make more music. I know I'm very excited to do this as I'm working on this. It's the same thing. You're going to be listening to me dissecting those pieces of music, but for me personally, it was a quest too. It's like, well, I can talk about so many things. What am I going to talk about? And then, sure enough, these things start to transpire, and then I start working with it. And today, of course, with the internet and a lot of public domain works that were written before the copyright took place, those public domain works are available, and we can now look at the manuscripts of the composers, which was unthinkable even just a couple of decades ago. You would have to physically go to where the manuscript is held. You know, nobody had pictures of it, really. Now they're one click away. So hopefully you will be inspired by this, and will continue making music if you are already, or maybe even start making music if you aren't yet. So let's look at what's coming. So Composer's Lab will be 12 classes, 12 sessions, and then each session after this one will focus on a specific composer. Let's just start looking at them. There are 10 of them, so don't think of them as top 10 list, please. It's not. it's more of a chronological list with, lots of gaps, if you will. So if here is, for instance, Chopin, and here's Tchaikovsky, which is next. Well, between Chopin and Tchaikovsky, there was some time period as well. Okay, so what we're going to do is when we do this course again, whenever that is in the future, we'll make sure that we keep numbering those sessions as number 13, number 14, and fill those gaps. And also go to more contemporary music. And who is to say that we couldn't do a composer's lab on a contemporary artist or a contemporary band? Living composers, that's all in the future. So for now, we're just kickstarting this, and here's what we're going to be getting. The first composer, of course, will be Bach, Johann Sebastian Bach. A lot of people would say that he is kind of like the godfather of music or professional music. There were quite a few composers before Bach, but what happened to us is that when Bach was kind of rediscovered and brought to worldwide limelight, we as human beings and musicians have suddenly realized that his influence has always been there. For instance, Mozart knew Bach's music. He actually was inspired by Bach's cantatas to write his symphony number 41 called Jupiter, and especially the double fugue at the end, which is very complex. That was, according to his letters, directly inspired by Bach's music, which he discovered at some point in his short life. So Bach is really the start of what we today call professional music making. And of course, there is his contemporaries. Handel was same age as Bach. Vivaldi was right there too. They all knew about each other. Bach and Handel never met in person, but they knew each other's music definitely, and you can almost tell maybe they were inspired by each other at times. So next composer is of course Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, and Mozart knew Bach, so this is a very or he knew his music rather, very good transition from Bach to Mozart. The third one is of course Beethoven. We could not possibly pass him by. Now he's somebody who we say in musical circles that he transitions from the classical period, the Baroque to classical to Romanticism, which was everything, after the Napoleon War and beyond in the 19th century, all the way until the 20th century kicked in, and then we went to perhaps modernism or other substreams of what we call modern music. There are a lot of those variables. Now, Franz Schubert comes right after Beethoven. Schubert absolutely adored Beethoven's music. He was his king in music. Schubert also lived a short life, and unfortunately he got ill and died in his 30s, but he was a very, very studious musician, and he did write a lot of music. Some of his symphonic music may even be a little bit drawn out sometimes, but that was his writing style. That's what was coming through, is that the expression, the wordiness of it, the all these epithets, kind of like succinct poetry versus maybe prose, where a whole page describes one room, let's say, that you have entered. That would be something like Schubert. After Schubert is, of course, Frédéric Chopin. Chopin was born in Poland, lived in France, died in France. So he's a Polish composer who is also a French composer by proxy, I guess, or by his life. But Chopin set up a lot for the 19th century. The next composer on this list is Tchaikovsky. Now, you can actually hear similarities in their approach, how they both approach the melody, how they both approach the counterpoint, and especially the textures, right? And we're going to be playing in a second. So Tchaikovsky, of course, symphony genius. You know, Nutcracker is just one of the pieces that he wrote. His 6 symphonies are still played throughout the world. His operas are staged, especially in Russia. And of course, his piano music is played throughout the world. There's a Tchaikovsky competition in Moscow for piano and violin and cello and vocals. So Tchaikovsky will be a very interesting quest for us. The next one is maybe unusual. I actually thought of who I would like to present here in this kind of transitional time period. And I thought that we would have an Italian composer on this list. And of course, Italy, the birthplace of opera as we know it, today, you know, as a big production, whatnot. Well, France and Italy can tug of war on that one, but whoever is listening, you can tell me what you think about this. But we normally tend to think of Italy when we think of opera today. So Verdi will be a very good demonstration of how composers could use music and lyrics and staging to basically go through a scene with the changing emotions. We'll be looking at that with Verdi. So Claude Debussy. Debussy in French, or Debussy, many ways to say that in English. I think Debussy, I would say that. So Claude Debussy, French, and we call them French Impressionists. Impressionism is, of course, originally a term for visual arts, but with the coining of the term by the critics somewhere, it got stuck with some of the French composers of that same time period, and Debussy would be perhaps the pioneer of that new way of writing by using color and different sonorities and exotic scales and modes. So we're going to be looking at that with Debussy. Stravinsky, again, a Russian composer that ended up here in the US. Stravinsky started as a young hotshot, we would say today. He was working with Sergei Diaghilev in the Russian ballet Russe in Paris. And so Diaghilev had some other composer writing for him. He wasn't very happy with that other composer, so he called the young Stravinsky to write a ballet for him, and the rest is history. He wrote several ballets for him, and they worked together, and that's what gave Stravinsky a big head start in his career and fame. And the last one, not least one, is the one from the 20th century. George Gershwin was also Russian by not birth, but his ancestry. And he lived in New York, of course. He started as a... He was demonstrating new songs. Think about it. How would people hear new pop songs? Well, somebody would play it to them almost like a traveling salesman of new popular music. So that's how he started, and he quickly got drawn into composition. Even went to, as a side note, to try to study with Ravel. This is from just music history books. And apparently Ravel said, rather than you be a little Ravel, I want you to be a big Gershwin, or something to that effect. In other words, he refused to teach him because he said, oh, you're just going to try to be like me, but I would rather you be like you. So that is our list of the composers. It's not full. There are composers that are my favorite, ones that are not on this list. For instance, Sergei Rachmaninoff. So again, future installations of the Composers Lab will definitely cover these gaps. So let us see what are some of the ways that composers use. Let's get into the mindset of some of them. Here are the famous 4 notes. Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. And as you know, he immediately goes on to develop it. etc. You know the music. So, according to one of my teachers who heard it somewhere, so this is on the scale of being an urban myth. I could not find any proof or any other mentioning of it, but I've heard it from more than one person, teacher, and another person, so I know this may be true. Let's just consider it as if we know that one of Beethoven's sketchbooks contained this version, among others perhaps, of the opening motif. Let's hear it. Interesting, right? So let's say it's true, and here we see this, as opposed to dap 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 dap. So what is different? Why did he pick this? What makes it better? Now, when you think of melody, so this is melody, right? Da 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 da. That's also a melody, little melodic phrase. When you think of melody, it helps to think in terms of something stretchable, like a rubber band. You stretch it, it tends to want to squish back, and when you squish it back, you have the ability to stretch it again, right? And that's the same with melody, as you have tension and you have relaxation. The same way as we tense and relax our vocal cords. You know, when you say higher pitch, higher is more tense. It takes more energy, more muscular power to produce that sound. Whereas in the low pitches or frequencies, right, the system that produces a sound, be it the body or be it an instrument with its own body and excitation mechanisms such as strings or reeds or lips of the brass player. So the lower frequencies, of course, will need less of tension and more relaxed and more resonance. So they use more of the actual body of the instrument or the person. Now, there is a principle in animation. If you were to study traditional hand-drawn animation, and I've been always interested in it, and I have friends who do it professionally, there's a principle in animation called squish and stretch. Squish and stretch of a character. Think about this, right? Here's this cartoon character jumping. It stretches. As it lands, it squishes. Famous example is the ball exercise, bouncing ball exercise that pretty much all animators have done at some point in their life. For instance, when you think of good melodies, here's something you know. Now let's look what's happening here. Let's just see if we can look at on the keyboard. We leap all the way. This is called an octave. So a big leap, right? Big leap. All right. So when you do this big leap, what does your mind and soul tell you? What are you going to keep expanding it? Probably not. I mean, your human nature wants to, now that you've stretched so much, wants to squish again, and that's what happens here. And then we go back down and we leap again, but not as much, okay? And then we go down a little bit, and then we go back to where we started. We leap again, a lot less. And then we go again and basically close this gap here and come back to the note that we started from. So almost like this. So that's a good example of squish and stretch. You know, not all melodies start with such a giant leap. If you start with a smaller leap, then of course you have a choice. Then you actually have some leverage to go up or down. In this case, that's pretty apparent that it will be closing that gap right there. When I was preparing this and conceptualizing the whole thing, really, just thinking how it can be, one of my inspirations is lectures by Leonard Bernstein. When the Lincoln Center opened in New York City, Bernstein was the head of the New York Philharmonic Orchestra, and he started doing these concerts called Young People Concerts. Now, if you look, and they were televised too. They were recorded, actually, pre-recorded and televised on the networks. So you'll see full house at those concerts, and every single concert. He had the full orchestra behind him, and he would show things on the piano, and then he would conduct the orchestra and say, here's 2 measures, and here are these 2 other measures. So pretty much very similar to what we're doing today. In one of his lectures, I think it's called What is Music? As a matter of fact, I very much encourage you, if you're interested in this, you will definitely like the Bernstein's lectures if you haven't seen them. One of them is, I believe, called What is Music? And then he literally starts with that question, what is music? What makes music music? And then he says, is classical music, what's classical music? Well, classical is a time period only, right, between Baroque and Romanticism. So he says we can't call all music classical. So he goes through all of these motions to dismiss all the names that people commonly call it. Serious music. Well, a pop song can be serious. A classical piece can be comical. Music for orchestra. No, because, we also use orchestra for other things, right? That we wouldn't brand as classical music. So his conclusion was that we want to call it exact music. Exact. Well, because a composer actually wrote the notes and the indications on how to play those notes and the tempo in the score, right, and wrote all these different parts for the different instruments. We interpret that music. It's almost like a storyboard from a movie, right? The director and his crew or his aides, whoever works with the director, scriptwriter, probably, they designed the storyboard with the actual little frames of what's going on the screen, with the arrows pointing to where the camera will move or the characters will move, and of course the lines of dialogue, usually on the right side next to the slide, kind of like this: picture, text, picture, text. Written music is a lot like that. So Bernstein came up with the word exact, but then what about electronic music that we can do today? Before the so-called phonograph, and now, of course, we have, everything else, right? Before sound recording, the only way to record music was to either have it on a mechanical device like a music box or a player piano later on, or to write it down and pass the score. And those who can read the score can reconstruct the music in the composer's head. But what about electronic music today, where a composer actually conceptualizes all the parts and layers them one by one to create the full score in a studio? That's exact music, but it's not. It may not be classical music. So I think that the distinction may be that whether the performance itself is part of the musical piece or not. Because if the performance is a part of the musical piece, let's say it's a collective improvisation, like in jazz we'll have that a lot, to where we're not even following the chart, we're just like jamming, as they say, right? In rock, of course, we do it all the time, in blues. So that music, the performance is a part of the music, and we might hear this one guitar lick, as we call them, and say, oh, wow, that came out so good, it's so soulful. Well, we're talking about the performance here. We're not talking about the notes that were played. We're talking about how they were played. So I think that as long as the performance is the integral part of the music, we probably would not brand it as classical. And again, those who are listening and would like to comment on this, please feel free, because this could start a very good discussion. And of course, Bernstein is no longer with us, but he might hear it. somehow metaphysically and maybe even discuss it with us metaphysically. So I think, honestly, perhaps the composer actually wants to leave certain things to your imagination, just like a writer would leave it to your imagination to imagine the sets and the plots and the characters. So let's take this Nocturne by Chopin. By the way, this is actually a first edition of the Nocturne, and nowadays you can find they're all in public domain. They've been posted on imslp.org, which is the International Music Source Library Project. It's a nonprofit organization. I absolutely love them. They support the unveiling of important documents like this. So here's, Chopin Nocturne. You've heard it millions of times, probably. And then it keeps going with a little variation. And then he goes to the middle part. Beautiful music. So here's the sheet music, right? This is something that Chopin looked at and approved. What we see, and if you don't read sheet music, that's quite all right, because it's shape-based. So it's almost like looking at a piece of artwork or maybe some sort of code or foreign language, perhaps, if you don't read music. But of course, it's called the grand staff, treble clef, bass clef for right hand and left hand. And then there we go, as these two lines just keep giving us the two-handed music for the piano. The top line, of course, is the melody, and you can see how it goes up and down. So you can actually follow along if you don't read music. Maybe you would be encouraged to look into just looking up how to read music if you don't. But let's say we play this as written in this score. So here is, you see PED and asterisks underneath. Perhaps you can see them on the screen. Well, that's for the right pedal. That's a sustain pedal, right? To sustain the sound. So if we play exactly what's written here, or try to, I actually have a metronome here. Let's see what it says. It says 132. So we're going to set it to 132 right there. And we're going to wind it up, old technology. And yeah, we better put it on a even surface. There we go, that's about even. So these are the 8 notes. So, bum, ba, bum, ba. Let's try it. Here we go. This is quite a bit faster, actually, than most people play it. So what do we have here? Why does that happen? So, for instance, if we didn't have the metronome, we would probably start deviating the tempo a little bit. Let's say that's our tempo. Right here. Right, a little bit of a moment of hesitation, and of course here. As well, right? In music we call it agogics. So this is the actual rubato, which means vary throughout. So with variations. So now, if we played it without the pedal, what do we get? We pretty much get a waltz. So let's say if we didn't have any of these indications, we just had the notes, no pedal indications, and no tempo, we would probably play it, and no slurs. You see how, as a matter of fact, if you can see it full screen, the actual slide, you will see where these notes are. The slurs are right there between the second and third note of each figure here. Da, 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 like this. So if they weren't there, it would sound like this. Like a waltz. That actually tells us that the indications sometimes are even more important than the actual notes. So, as a matter of fact, let's go back to Beethoven's Fifth Symphony for a second, and I got a treat for you here, which is pages from Beethoven's manuscript. Again, thanks to IMSLP, how else could we even get a glimpse of what Beethoven's manuscript looked like? So here we have from his Fifth Symphony a very familiar passage. All right, so this page and the next page right there. Very familiar passage. Now, when we looked at his indications, yeah, everything looks good, but let's follow the main melodic line. And of course, you can see it's shorthand, like he doesn't even have some of the instruments here. This is kind of like, oh, this is like what the main gist of it is going to be. You know, he was a very fast writer in this case, you know, so it's like, oh, here we go, here we go, here we go. You can see like what's going on, how he is almost in a frenzy to write those horn parts in the middle. But let's look at this melody on the top. Right there, last two measures. Measure, of course, is bar lines, measures, same thing. So here we go, phrasing, slower, like that, together, and then separate notes. Okay, so here we go, next page. This is interesting. So the final version, as we can see, is same as the other one. Slurred notes, separate notes, slurred notes, separate notes, slurred notes, separate notes, slurred, separate, slurred, separate. But you see that he actually considered something else. That very first measure, the very top right corner, you see a little slur between the second note and the third. So if he actually kept, and then he probably said, nah, we'll just keep it uniform, make it more streamlined, right? So that's what it would have sounded like. And I think when he wrote it, he probably realized, we can't know why, but we can guess why, that he probably realized that it breaks the flow, but that not only it breaks the flow, it breaks this whole robustness of what he's trying to convey. You know, this is the fate knocking on the door, right? All of that, and then so this is still that same motive, or same, not motive, maybe same metaphor, probably. By the way, incidentally, the knocking on the door is not Beethoven's quote. It's his secretary and biographer, who now the music historians are even doubting that everything he said is true, that we think that he might have actually made some things up. But we can't know that. We can't know that. So let's look at another piece by Chopin. Bye-bye, Beethoven. This piece is a very well-known waltz. Here's how it goes. and then it repeats. Okay, so we are looking again at the first edition in Chopin's times, and what I'd like to do is share this little quest. One older gentleman that I know pointed out to me, oh, he said, do you know that the first edition of Chopin, the second measure and the third measure have a totally different left-hand part from what we play today. So I went to research this. Again, thanks, we have all of these different editions now available to us to look at, for us to look at. Okay, let's look at the left hand. Right hand, melody. All is swell, that you'll see that in pretty much every edition. Let's look at the left hand. Here's left hand. Measure, well, first is not a measure, first is called a pickup, right? So just one note in there, ah, boom, measure starts. Measure 1, measure 2, measure 3, measure 4. So what we have is a full cadence, as we call it in music. So it starts with the main chord, it goes through these chords, and then it comes back to the main chord. Okay, so we have kind of a sense of closure coming back to the main chord again. But look at the inner voices here. So what we have is this movement here of the middle voice right here, and then it moves downwards, and then it moves upwards again. And that is actually mirrored in the bass line, if you look at it. Here's the bass, here's the middle part, bass, second measure, middle part, third measure, bass, middle part, fourth measure. So they go in parallel, like this. Well, let's start looking at other editions. For instance, here is this edition, and this edition is actually made by Claude Debussy. Claude Debussy is a French composer, of course, and he's the one who wrote the Impressionist music, all right? You know, he was also a publisher, and he did a lot of things. He was an educator. So apparently, this one here is from the edition that Debussy published. Well, in this edition from Debussy, we have this note not going down, but remaining like this. All right. So what it sounds like is this. And then there's another edition where the left hand goes like this. So it kind of counteracts the line of the bass, right? If the bass goes here, this voice goes here, the bass goes downwards, this voice goes here, and they come back. So now, which version is better? Now, if you ask, Chopin, of course, wrote what he wrote, and then all these other editors, you know, had their own opinion of what it should be. But basically, this version that Chopin wrote is again more streamlined because we have this parallelism here, but it's also more simplistic. It's simple. There is certain heartfelt, you know, expression in it. It's not contrived. Whereas, let's say this version, where you have these proper voice leading, you know, this note is present in the bass, so it's not present in the chord. This note is in the bass, now it's not in the chord. This one is in the chord. So it sounds a little contrived. And basically, what we have to do is then we have to pick and choose, and we say the version that Chopin, I would always personally play the Chopin's version on this one. Well, this is all the time we have today. So our next session will be really exciting. We're going to start going through each composer's output and get into their mind. And the next session will be about Bach. And I'd like to finish with the same theme that I opened with. I actually wrote this theme back in the 2000s. You know, I was working on a lot of different music for themes, for sports and things like that. And this one was kind of like a game show theme, and I never had any use for it until now. So I've officially made it the Composer's Lab theme. So with this, I'm going to sign out for now. Thanks for joining us. On behalf of the Interactive Academy, we wish you happy composing. See you next time. Now we will have an open forum discussion. Joining me here online are Tom Dietz in the left top corner. Next to Tom, you see Daniel Cortez, and then next to me on the bottom is Michael Reed. So we'll start with Tom Dietz, please, and then just go in the circle.
Good afternoon, students. My name is Tom Dietz. I'm a professor of saxophone at Valencia College here on the east side of Orlando, Florida. I have a bachelor's degree in jazz saxophone performance from the University of North Florida in the early 90s, a master's degree of performance classical flute from UCF 2010. I'm a working musician, performing musician with a variety of genres, maybe 15 different groups per year that I work with.
Thank you, Tom. Daniel?
So I'm a viola player. I play with a few of the orchestras in the area, and recently stepped into a conductor position, and also within the past couple of years have been doing arts admin as well.
For sure, yes. Many musicians can attest to the fact that we all have to multitask and be very versatile, including non-musical activities. Michael?
Yeah, my name is Michael Reed. I live here in Orlando, Florida. I am an audio specialist. I do live and studio audio engineering and sound design for movies and video games. I've worked with Sergei and Daniel both, and I'm happy to be here.
Thank you. Well, let's start a discussion. When we were just logging in, we were kind of pre-thinking what we're going to talk about. Turns out that the presentation that we just saw stirs some discussions as per interpretive qualities of music. In other words, does the music have to be played exactly like the composer wrote it? What the leeways are? What if the composer only wrote the notes but not the indications? Do we have to be authentic to what we know as the way to play it from historically, or can we take liberties and still be true to the source? So Tom, I would like to hear what you think as a jazz player, as an educator, what your thoughts on this are.
Well, as a jazz player, and our main line of work is improvisational. We do take forms, we do take very traditional classical pieces of jazz music spanning a good 70, 80-year stretch. And you can do a number of things with it. You can play things note for note as is, if you're doing a very traditional piece of music in the traditional style, something called traditional jazz or trad jazz, which goes all the way back to the 20s and the 30s, the 19 teens, Louis Armstrong. Basically, we think of that as Beethoven music, but there's an awful lot of other stuff that comes out of that. A lot of those types of orchestras and small ensembles play note for note. They're hired to play note for note, hired to play in a certain style for a certain type of event, corporate event or a party. But then you can get into a completely free improvisation, and it's not a far leap from one to the other. So having skills to do all that is quite important as an educator, and I've been doing that for a while now. there's a million ways to try and educate a young musician's mind into how to freely step away from the chart, for example, and express themselves in the form of the tune. Probably the most important thing is keeping the form of the tune in the back of the head all the time, so that when you do step away, you can make sense of what you're doing. And a lot of great compositional music is tension and release, or tension and resolution, an alternate dominant chord resolving. That's basically the basis of all composition, if you think about it. And in an improvisational sense, we just do that shortened up in a 1 minute stretch or a 2 minute stretch, as opposed to a 15-minute, 20-page orchestral arrangement. But it is pretty similar.
Yeah, right. It's interesting how when we talk about jazz, everybody thinks, oh, jazz improvisation, and then you get, like you said, into big band charts, and everything has to be absolutely exact, and all these to-do, ta, pa, pa, all these phrasing marks have to be obeyed like it's the word of God. How do you approach, keeping true to the spirit versus making suggestions and improvements to the material?
Sure. I mean, a lot of the clients, you guys were saying before, think they want playing perfect. And for someone that's not as experienced, I think following what's written is best. But once you're extremely experienced, you know when and how to break the rules, and when to improve on things, and how to make them better. I'm not a traditionalist. I'm all for let's make it better.
Yeah, for sure. Well, in the modern culture, not everything is preconceived or written down. People will come in. As a matter of fact, you and I just had a client who might be coming back who said, well, I'm actually looking to work with somebody like you guys who can, help me polish and improve, because, he like, as he said, I'm not a pro in this, but I hear this music in my head. So yeah, it's interesting that, those kinds of people are the ones who will benefit the most from, say, people like yourself who are seasoned in the field, don't you think?
Yeah, they're looking for innovation. They come in looking for that extra something. They don't know what it is. They just know they want something more added, another element. So, you just try to visualize what they want and give it to them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very, very good. Thank you. Daniel, I know that, of course, when you work with the orchestra, and you can tell us about the recent project. In fact, our team has recorded it, and we're about to do the post-production. Maybe you could tell us how you work with musicians, and when you play something that people know, let's say this piece from a famous video game, and I'm sure you will tell us about it, but how do you approach originality in repeatability versus innovation and freshness, something like that?
Sure. So you're constantly walking a tightrope between staying true to the original and doing something different and putting your own spin on it. Tom made a great point about, like, you have to be able to also span many styles. So there is, a way to, you can take the melody and the harmony of a piece and keep it the same, but then turn it into a different style, a rock style or a samba style, or, so there are so many different ways that you can find a compromise. And I think that really, and ultimately, you're just, the guiding principle is, does it sound good or not? There's no right way, there's no wrong way. You just use your ear and your judgment, and some people have naturally good judgment, some people have to develop that, some people have no hope. If you're lucky, you're working with a team that has the expertise, the insight, and the knowledge, and the good taste, to make these decisions. Ultimately, they're all judgment calls, and people are going to disagree with it no matter what. And if you can make a decision and you can stand by it, then I think that's your decision. And who's to say whether it's right or wrong?
Interesting point you brought about taste, because that is something that cannot really be explained or taught. It's kind of like when Tom, to tie it up with what Tom said, the 10,000 hours. I think when you're exposed to, you know, a lot of material, a lot of music, and you're studying it and accruing those 10,000 hours, I think that eventually it'll form that taste, and unless you're, you know, one of those hopeless people like you said, but I wouldn't call it hopeless. I would just say that certain people are probably predisposed more towards different activities just by nature, by how they're made up. You know, some people are more visual, some people are more, of course, more you know, hearing. Some people are more about touch. So yeah, so it may be that the you know, the people who couldn't make a good call. Let me just give you this. I mean, Glenn Gould starts his well-tempered clavier recording like this. And he plays this first prelude. Of course, this is, you know, what we call the Ave Maria, even though Bach did not write it as Ave Maria, but later, of course, they added the lyrics. And Gounod added the melody. But of course, this is not normally we think even people use the right pedal. You know, at weddings you hear it on a harp and so forth. But when Gould does this, what do you think? What do you think? What do Tom? What do you think? Let me ask Danny first, and then go to Tom. Is this showing off, or is this finding new meaning? Danny?
Well, I mean, it goes back to this subjective thing of taste. If you like smoother articulation, if you like a connected line, and that sounds good to you, then you do it. If you like a slightly more disconnected line, you know, and depending on the day, you might play differently from one day to the next, depending on how you feel. So I can't really say if I like one or the other. They both serve different purposes.
Right.
Yeah, it would depend on the situation and the scenario. If I'm going to hear something in a very traditional style and articulated and clean and to my ear older, to my ear, you know, 100 years more early, more harpsichordish and more plucked, then that's why I went to that concert to hear that. If I go, like you mentioned, to some more popular secular event with a wedding, and you don't know what you're going to get until you hear the musicians that are at the wedding, and they're covering things, but they're covering them in a very modern way. I could be offended if I just recently heard it in a chamber ensemble, or I could be greatly impressed because I didn't think about hearing it in a Fender Rhodes keyboard with, you know, a whole lot of connectivity and a really cool quiet bass line underneath in a jazz trio format. I always like hearing things, going back to when I was a kid, a teenager, I love hearing quote unquote covers of things done in a completely different style because it made a piece of music a melody that I already know, and for the layman, for the musicians, the non-musicians out there, they always want to hear the song that they know. If they hear it done in a different way and it's done well, they like it. And Armstrong said there's only two types of music, good and bad. So, you know, it really boils down to like Danny was talking about, taste.
Interesting. Yeah, form versus contents or something like that. Dialectics. Yeah, that is true. That is very true because I mean the composer obviously has an intention. You know, same piece could be played like this. In fact, if it were just a keyboard prelude, because prelude is something that precedes something bigger like a fugue or you know or a cantata, right, or something like that. So if you play it like this, you're basically saying, I'm just warming up, you know, the meat, the steak is to come. This is just like miso soup or something, right? But so miso. So I don't know why I said that, but let's keep it. Yes, Michael, what do you think about remakes? I mean, in general, like how do you feel about remakes?
I love to hear different takes on the same piece. I really do. But something that I was thinking about when you guys were talking is a lot of times, especially nowadays, music is intended to be married with picture, right? We have a lot of music for film, and people want to see visuals. And a lot of it's like, what emotion are you really trying to convey? and I think that you should play in the style that best conveys that emotion.
Very well.
Absolutely.
Very well said. Gentlemen, this is wonderful. It's been a great pleasure to have you here. Thank you for coming into my class virtually as it is, and looking forward to working with all of you in the nearest future. So thanks very much for being here. This is Composer's Lab, session 1, and the open forum panel with Thomas Dietz, Daniel Cortez, Michael Reed, and your host Sergei Kossenko, wishing you a great day. Bye-bye.